Thank you to all the members for supporting my channel. Hi there. Power creep. Oh, scary. Oh, shiver me timbers. Some of the day one players are quaking in their boots at the mention of power creep. And you know, I gotta say, it's kind of fair. See, at the end of the day, we all play gacha games. We all play Genshin. And all of us like to make sure that our favorite characters remain good for long periods of time. But I will be the first to admit that that's not really realistic. In an era where selling characters is highly dictated on how well they perform and how hot they are, it is very easy to get caught up in the power creep cast. And this is because, despite what a lot of players may tell you, throughout Genshin's history, all of the highest selling characters have been good. They've been meta, which means MiHoYo sees this sales figure and they realize, damn, if we want to make more money, we need to make more powerful characters, and we can see that coming into effect as of late. A good example I like to point to is Eula, because she is heavily exempt from the elemental mechanic, which I will talk about later, being a mainly physical DPS. Eula, on release, was one of the most, if not the most broken characters in the game, because she hardly needed a team comp in order to perform exceptionally well. In a game full of elements and elemental reactions, Eula was incredibly powerful in spite of her being a physical DPS. Yes, she had cryo tied to her kit, which made a lot of people think that she might have been a little bit better than she actually was, because cryo at the time was very dominant. I know, foreign concept. But she was still very, very strong, easily able to drop 100 to 300,000 damage in a single ultimate rotation, and back in version 1.5, that was an impressive number. But you see, there's something really special about Eula that I already teased at a minute ago. She's physical, which means she is exempt from the elemental mechanic system, so over time, she has gotten power creeped, and pretty significantly at that. And there's a reason for this. Genshin Impact is a game that is inherently built upon its elemental system. This elemental system is what most of its combat is based around. Every enemy, for the most part, is tied to an element, every shield is tied to an element, every character is tied to an element. There are very few neutral things in this game, and those that are weak to elements in some capacity, like Ruin Guards. And with the elemental system being as potent as it is, it makes it so that power creep is a very hard thing to efficiently have in this game, because if a character is bad, it really doesn't matter because they can always fall back on the elemental system. Allow me to give you a good example. Kuki Shinobu is a dogshit character, or at least, she was on release. And the main reason why she was considered bad was because, unfortunately, her scaling was mixed, her damage was unimpressive, and her healing wasn't that great. And at the time, Electro didn't have enough reactions to make it valuable enough to be worth using, which means, in the end of the day, Kuki was just cast to the side. She was deemed a worse version of every other healer that existed in the game, but that changed significantly when the Dendro system came out and it introduced the mechanic of Hyperbloom. Hyperbloom as a reaction is so overwhelmingly powerful that even a character like Kuki, who has unimpressive scalings, was able to compete with even the most powerful of characters, and now she is one of the most wanted healers in the game for her capacity on Hyperbloom teams. And the same can be said to lesser extents of characters that have come out in the past. Here's a great example. Some of the most powerful characters in the game are what I like to refer to as the National Core. These characters being Zhengling, Bennett, Sucrose, Fischl, and Jingshou. These are 4 stars that have come out on Genshin's release, which are still to this day some of the most dominantly overpowered characters in the game's history. When I make videos talking about characters who are exceptionally overpowered, these are some of the characters that come to mind. And notice how all of them are 4 stars. Now if you take a look through the game's history and the game's scaling, you'll see that over time the damage scaling of new characters has significantly increased. So why is it that these characters are still meta? Well, it's because of their reactions they provide. At the end of the day, their personal damage is whatever. It's not bad, it's actually really good in some cases, but they're useful for their ability to support the rest of their team with elemental reactions. For example, Zhengling, to this day, is still the best off-field pyro applicator we have in the entire game. Jingshou is the best off-field hydro applicator in the entire game, meaning meaning they can make use of Vape, Freeze, and Melt, which means some of the more overpowered teams that make use of some of the more overpowered characters essentially have to have these characters on the team. Jingshou is locked in on Hu Tao Vape teams, and he's also a core slot on Hyper Bloom teams. Zhangling is really good on teams like International and Vape Mulani and Knitch Burning teams. Fischl and her A4 passive as well as her C6 make it to where that she can perform significantly well and aggravate in Quick Bloom teams for her ability to quickly proc elemental reactions. Sucrose can allow you to shred res, swirl, increasing elemental mastery, which makes the reactions that your characters are doing even stronger. By this point, you've probably noticed that pretty much every character that I've mentioned up until this point has one powerful thing in their kit, and that is the reaction system. You see, in Genshin, your element actually means more than your damage scaling, because if you have a powerful element and you have a powerful reaction tied to it, and the ability to efficiently proc that reaction, or hell, in some cases even unefficiently proc that reaction, you can still be good. This makes power creeping any character outside of the meta pretty much impossible to do. But you see, Genshin takes it a step further, because even though the elemental system makes it really hard to completely power creep units out of relevance like other games do, not looking at any games in particular, Honkai Star Rail, Genshin also goes back and significantly buffs characters on previous releases. Going back to Zhangling, it was a meme for a while that every time a new polearm came out in Genshin's history, Zhangling was able to use it. Favonia's Spear, the Catch, Engulfing Lightning, Staff of Scarlet Sands. Just a few examples that immediately came to mind. These weapons have made Zhangling's damage ceiling significantly increase over time, while also allowing her to release some of her downsides, like her very, very hungry energy recharge mechanic. But it goes even further past weapons, because a lot of the times, new artifact sets will retroactively buff a number of characters. For example, one of my favorite things to point to is the Husk of Opulent Dream set, which gave pretty much every Geo character in the game a significant buff. Characters like Albedo, Arataki Ito, Noelle, and a few others received buffs that it basically doubled their damage just from one patch that buffed Geo as a whole. Another one I also like to point to is the Mero Trusei Hunter set, which increases crit rate for the team by 36% as long as you're gaining and losing HP, which leads me into my next point. Characters that release in the future also happen to go back and retroactively make units in the past that were not that good significantly better than they used to be. Farina as a character is incredibly powerful because she can buff the entire team's damage by a significant portion, but on top of that, Farina made a bunch of old characters a lot more powerful by giving them access to the Hunter set. That is, so long as Farina is on the team with them. And Farina herself, even without an artifact set, made some characters who used to not be very good, good again, like Jean, for example, who hadn't been meta for a very long time, outside of niche cases on Sunburst teams, was one of the best, and I would argue still the best healer for her teams. This was because of her ability to burst heal the entire team back to full in less than half a second while also shredding res at the same time, making it so that you could get full fanfare stacks for a full damage bonus while also shredding res, keeping uptime on your DPSs significantly higher. And on top of that, other characters come out and just buff entire archetypes. We have had examples of characters like Shenhe, Goro, Kujo Sora, and Farazan completely buffing the entire archetype of the element they're on. Hell, I would even argue Chevreuse buffed Electro and Pyro significantly. This made a bunch of characters who in the past weren't that good significantly better just by proxy of their existence, and this is not something that we've just seen once, twice, or 3 times. So this is a consistent reoccurring pattern throughout the entirety of Genshin's history. The fact of the matter is, Genshin has so many mechanics in place that make it very hard for characters to actually get fully power crept out of the meta. Now, am I saying that power creep doesn't exist at all? Absolutely not. No, not even a little bit, because the fact of the matter is there are still some characters that come out that just completely dog water other characters. A good example I like to point to is the Arlanchino versus Hu Tao debate. Yeah, Arlanchino is better than Hu Tao. If you deny that, you're on crack. You're just wrong. Like, you are just wrong. Arlanchino is better. And I love Hu Tao significantly more than I like Arlanchino, but I'm not gonna sit here and cope. But once again, I'd like to point out that the power creep doesn't really matter for a couple reasons. One, it is super slow. It took almost 4 years for Hu Tao to finally be power crept out of her spot as the #1 Pyro DPS. 4 whole years before we finally got something better. Bennett hasn't been directly power crept, but he's slowly been getting phased out of some of his best teams with the introduction of EM scaling and HP scaling. But does that mean Bennett and Hu Tao aren't good anymore? power? No, they're still more than powerful enough to easily beat the Spiral Abyss, because the final point I want to mention is, even though Genshin does have power creep, and that is undeniable, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, in the in-game difficulty, you can clear it with pretty much every character in the game. In most circumstances, no matter how dog water your character is, you can expect them to receive some buffs in the future throughout the number of listings that I've made throughout the video. Which brings me back to my opening statement. There are some instances where characters become irrelevant, and that is when they don't follow any of the criteria that I have named before. Eula. This right here is the prime example of power creep. You did not follow any of Genshin's normal mechanics. You scaled off physical, no elemental reactions needed for your damage, and unfortunately, your damage scaling is rather low in the grand scheme of things, with modern day characters like Kanich and Mulani able to deal your damage in 7 seconds with no energy recharge requirement on their skill. So yes, Eula is evident that power creep does exist, and some characters can be pushed out of the meta given enough time, but I would argue Eula can still clear. So is it really such a big deal? No. Don't let players fear tactic you out of using the characters you want to use, because at the end of the day, Genshin is a very casual, very off-meta game. Use what you want, build what you want, have your own fun, and let that be that. With that all being said, like, comment, subscribe. See ya.